Picture this. You leave home for a couple of years, you tell your family to sit tight, you'll be back soon with supplies and everything they need. You come back, and everyone is just gone. Not moved to a new neighborhood, gone. Not left a note on the fridge, gone. 115 people, vanished. No bodies, no wreckage, no signs of struggle, just empty buildings, overgrown paths, and one single cryptic word carved into a wooden post like the world's most unsettling voicemail. That's not the opening of a horror movie. That's a real thing that happened on American soil in 1590. And over 400 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer for what happened to those people. Welcome back to Mystique History. Today we are talking about one of the oldest and most haunting mysteries in American history, the lost colony of Roanoke. Buckle in, because this story has everything: political intrigue, survival drama, desperate expeditions, indigenous diplomacy, and one of the most chilling cliffhangers in the entire story of the United States. Let's go. To understand why this colony was attempted in the first place, you have to understand what late 16th century Europe felt like from the perspective of England. It's the 1580s. Spain is the dominant superpower of the Western Hemisphere. They've been colonizing Central and South America for nearly a century and have accumulated staggering amounts of wealth from the Americas. Gold, silver, agricultural products, trade routes. Spain is essentially running the table, and England, under Queen Elizabeth I, is sitting across the room watching all of this with extremely envious eyes. England wants in. They want their own piece of the American continent, their own trade routes, their own resources, their own foothold in the New World before Spain locks up every inch of it. And the man who was most aggressively pushing this vision was a wealthy English nobleman named Sir Walter Raleigh. If you know anything about Walter Raleigh, you know he was the kind of guy who had massive ambition, serious charm, and a genuinely impressive ability to convince Queen Elizabeth that his ideas were great. He had already been granted a royal charter to explore and colonize the eastern coast of North America. He was ready to build England's future. Now, Raleigh himself never actually went to Roanoke. Important detail: he organized the expeditions, he funded them significantly, he got the royal backing, but he stayed in England. The actual work of crossing the Atlantic and figuring out how to establish a colony on a completely unfamiliar continent fell to other men. And in the late 1580s, that meant primarily a man named John White, who would become the governor of the Roanoke Colony, and whose connection to the people who disappeared makes this story deeply, personally heartbreaking in ways that a lot of people don't fully appreciate. But before White, there was an earlier expedition. In 1585, a group of English explorers had already been sent to the area. They established a small military outpost on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, scouted the region, made contact with local indigenous nations, including the Croatoan and the Secatan peoples, and generally tried to figure out whether this location was viable for a permanent settlement. They also encountered, let's just say, significant challenges: food shortages, tensions with neighboring indigenous communities that escalated after some English soldiers took aggressive and, frankly, unjustifiable actions against local villages in response to a perceived theft. By the time Sir Francis Drake showed up in 1586, after raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, the 1585 colony was in rough enough shape that most of the men were ready to pack up and go home. And so they did. They left behind a small holding force of 15 men to maintain the English claim to the territory. 15 men, on an island, off the coast of North Carolina, with limited supplies and surrounded by indigenous communities who had very recent, very specific reasons not to trust English colonizers. We don't know exactly what happened to those 15 men. When the next expedition arrived, they found no survivors, just a skeleton. That was the only evidence anyone had been there. You would think that outcome might give the planners back in England some pause. You would think someone might go, the last group we left there didn't work out great. Maybe let's reconsider the location. But here's the thing about colonial ambition in the 1580s. Caution was not exactly the vibe. England needed a foothold in the Americas, and they needed it before Spain decided to come up the eastern coastline. So in 1587, a new expedition was organized. A bigger one. A more ambitious one. Not just a military outpost this time, but a genuine attempt at a self-sustaining civilian settlement. This time, the colony would include families, women, children, people who were meant to build something permanent, not just hold a military position. The group that set sail in 1587 included 115 men, women, and children. The plan was to actually settle slightly further north, in the Chesapeake Bay area, which was considered more strategically viable than Roanoke Island. But when the ships arrived, the captain of the fleet, a man named Simon Fernandez, basically refused to take them any further. He had his own timeline, his own priorities on the Atlantic voyage, and he told the colonists that Roanoke Island was close enough and they could figure the rest out themselves. Just dropped them at the spot the previous failed expedition had occupied and said, "Good luck." Captain of the Year. Really inspiring leadership. So there they were, 115 colonists on a remote island with the ruins of the previous settlement around them, knowing that 15 men left behind by the earlier expedition had disappeared without a trace, and they were supposed to start building a future. There's something about that moment that hits different when you really sit with it. These were not soldiers. These were regular English people, tradespeople and farmers and families who had crossed an ocean and were now standing on the edge of a continent they didn't know, with inadequate supplies, diplomatic tensions already in place from the previous expedition's actions, and a captain who had basically just ghosted them. One very famous moment happened almost immediately. On August 18, 1587, just weeks after the colony arrived, a baby was born. Her name was Virginia Dare. She was the daughter of John White's daughter, Ananias and Eleanor Dare. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in what would become the United States of America. That's her legacy in the history books. She was also, almost certainly, one of the people who disappeared. Think about that for a second. America's first English-born child vanished before she was old enough to walk. John White, the governor, quickly realized that the colony was in serious trouble. Supplies were dangerously low. Relations with some neighboring indigenous nations were tense. The colonists needed support, and they needed it fast. So the decision was made that White himself would sail back to England to organize a resupply mission. He left in late 1587, just weeks after his granddaughter Virginia was born. He left behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and 113 other people who were counting on him to come back quickly. He planned to be gone for a few months at most. That was the plan. He didn't come back for 3 years. Here's where world events absolutely derailed everything. White arrived back in England in late 1587, and England was in full-on national emergency mode. The Spanish Armada was coming. Spain, fed up with English naval harassment and religious conflict, had assembled the most powerful naval fleet the world had seen up to that point and was heading directly for England. Queen Elizabeth's government commandeered every available ship for the national defense, every single ship, including the ones White desperately needed to return to Roanoke with supplies. It was like trying to get a flight home during a hurricane and finding out the airlines have been nationalized to deal with a larger crisis. John White was completely stuck. He did manage to arrange a small expedition in 1588, which was turned back by Spanish privateers. He finally secured passage on a fleet in 1590, arriving at Roanoke in mid-August of that year. 3 years after he had left his daughter, his granddaughter, and 113 other people behind. The island was silent. The settlement was empty. The buildings were deteriorating. The colonists' possessions were scattered and damaged. Some had been buried, others exposed to the elements. There was no sign of the people themselves, no indication of a rapid or chaotic departure, no signs of the kind of struggle that would suggest a sudden devastating confrontation. It was almost as if the colony had been methodically packed up and vacated, almost. And then White found the carving. On a large wooden post, someone had carved 5 letters, Croatoan, and on a nearby tree, 3 more letters, CRO. That was it. That was everything they left. Before he had departed in 1587, White had arranged a signal with the colonists. If they had to relocate for any reason, they would carve the name of their destination. If they had left under distress or danger, they would carve a cross above the name. There was no cross, just Croatoan, no cross, no distress signal, just a place name. Croatoan was the name of a large island about 50 miles to the south, now known as Hatteras Island, and also the name of the indigenous people who lived there. The Croatoan people had been, in contrast to some other neighboring nations, generally friendly and cooperative with the English colonists. A man named Monteo, who was Croatoan, had actually traveled to England twice before and served as a crucial translator and diplomatic liaison for the English expeditions. The Croatoan connection was the colonists' best relationship in the entire region. So the message seemed clear. They went to Croatoan, go to Croatoan Island, find the Croatoan people, find the colonists. White desperately wanted to sail south immediately and search the island. The ship's captains did not want to do that. The weather was turning dangerous. The ships had taken damage. They needed to resupply in the Caribbean before winter. They said they'd come back in the spring. They didn't come back in the spring. No follow-up search was conducted in any meaningful way for years afterward. Multiple planned relief expeditions were canceled for various reasons, primarily funding issues and the chaotic state of English colonial politics. John White never returned to Roanoke again. He never found out what happened to his daughter or his granddaughter. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland, writing about the expedition in terms of profound personal regret and loss. His journals are some of the most complete accounts we have of the whole story, and reading them knowing what he didn't know and never would know is genuinely one of the saddest experiences you can have as a history reader. So what actually happened? This is where we get into the theories, and honestly, the historical detective work here has only gotten more sophisticated and interesting in recent decades. The most widely supported modern theory, and the one that has the most archaeological and historical backing, is that the colonists integrated with the Croatoan people. That facing starvation, supply failures, and the reality that no relief was coming, the colonists made the rational decision to ask for help from the one indigenous group they knew they could approach. They moved south to Croatoan Island. They lived among the Croatoan people, and over time, they blended into that community. There's actually meaningful evidence for this. In the early 1700s, English explorer John Lawson spent time among the Hatteras Island people who were descendants of the Croatoan, and reported something remarkable in his journals. The Hatteras people told him that several of their ancestors could talk in a book, meaning they were literate, a skill that was not typical in that indigenous community at the time. He also noted that a significant number of them appeared to have gray eyes, an unusual physical characteristic in the region. Lawson was suggesting, not conclusively, that this community had English ancestry mixed in. In 2020 and in subsequent years, the First Colony Foundation, a nonprofit research organization that has been conducting systematic archaeological investigation of the region, found consistent material evidence of English presence on Hatteras Island that dates to the late 16th and early 17th century. English copper, European-style artifacts, evidence of what appears to be early English-style construction techniques in an area that would have been Croatoan territory. The archaeology is telling a consistent story that points toward English-Croatoan contact and integration. There's a competing theory, somewhat darker, that involves the Powhatan Confederacy, the large and powerful indigenous political alliance that dominated the Chesapeake region further north. In 1607, when the Jamestown colonists arrived, they heard from the Powhatan chief Wahun Seneca, commonly known as Powhatan, that a group of people who had lived at the site of the original planned Roanoke settlement destination in Chesapeake Bay, who dressed like Europeans and lived in stone houses, had recently been eliminated by Powhatan forces. He apparently showed the Jamestown colonists copper and iron tools that he claimed came from this group. This account is troubling and has never been fully explained away. It's possible that some of the Roanoke colonists did eventually make their way north toward the original intended Chesapeake Bay destination and encountered Powhatan resistance. It's also possible the story was exaggerated or misunderstood in translation. We don't know. A third theory that gets less serious scholarly attention, but still floats around, is that the colonists attempted to build or commandeer a vessel and sail back toward England or toward other European ships, and were lost at sea. Given the state of their resources and shipbuilding capacity, most historians consider this unlikely for the full group, though some subset of colonists might have attempted it. What makes the Roanoke mystery so enduring isn't just the dramatic disappearance itself, it's the layers. The fact that the answer, when we find it, will tell us something profound about how European colonization actually worked at the ground level. Not the heroic myth of it, not the triumphant narrative of conquest and settlement, but the messy human reality of what happened when people were stranded far from home with no backup, completely dependent on the goodwill and knowledge of the people whose land they had arrived on. The most likely answer, that they survived by becoming Croatoan, is not a failure story. It's actually a remarkable human story of adaptation and cooperation. It suggests that at least some of the Roanoke colonists understood something that took mainstream colonial policy decades to learn, which is that survival in this new world required relationship, not domination. Required asking for help, not demanding resources. Required becoming part of the community, rather than imposing one's own structure on it. Virginia Dare, if she survived, would have grown up speaking Croatoan, would have learned to fish and navigate the barrier islands in ways no English child ever had before, would have been, in the truest possible sense, the first American, born on this soil and raised by it, by its people, by its languages and its ways. There's a bittersweet poetry to that. A child born into the aggressive, ultimately devastating project of English colonization, who may have found her life not in spite of that failure, but because of it. Because the colony failed to sustain itself as a separate English outpost, she had to be absorbed into something older and wiser, and more rooted in this land than any newcomer could possibly be. The Roanoke story doesn't end with a massacre. It probably doesn't end with ghost ships and mass tragedy, though those make better horror movies, and I completely understand why people go there. It probably ends much quieter and much more human, with a group of exhausted, cold, frightened people asking their neighbors for help, and their neighbors saying yes. We may never have a definitive answer. The archaeological evidence is suggestive and growing stronger every field season, but it may never produce the kind of conclusive proof that satisfies everyone. The documentary record has too many gaps, too many lost accounts, too many decades of neglect between the disappearance and any serious follow-up investigation. But here is what we do know. 115 people built something on Roanoke Island in 1587. They weren't statistics. They were people with names and families and skills and hopes. John White's daughter Eleanor was probably in her early 20s, trying to build a life on an unknown continent with a newborn baby and an absent father and a governor who never came back in time. Virginia Dare, the baby, never got to choose any of this. She was brought into the world on the edge of everything known and then lost to history before she could write a single word of her own story. And somewhere in the genetic record of families who have lived on the Outer Banks of North Carolina for generations, there may be a direct biological connection to those 115 people, to Eleanor, to Virginia, to all of them. Their story didn't end, it just changed form, became something the English historical record didn't know how to follow, because it became something genuinely new, something that belonged to this continent rather than to the one they came from. That's the real lost colony, not lost to catastrophe, lost to transformation. And in a way, that's the most American ending imaginable. Arriving somewhere as one thing and becoming something else entirely. Something new, something that didn't have a name yet. America has been doing that ever since. All right, I need to know what you think happened to the Roanoke colonists. Drop it in the comments. Did they integrate with the Croatoan people? Did some of them head north and face a darker fate? Is Virginia Dare somehow the ancestor of thousands of people living on the Carolina coast right now and just not knowing it? Let me know. The comment section on this channel gets genuinely fascinating on these topics, and I read more of them than I probably should. And if you're new here and this is your first stop at Mystique History, welcome. Hit subscribe and come along for the whole ride, because we've got mysteries lined up that are going to keep you up at night in the absolute best way. Hundreds of years of history still full of gaps and shadows and stories that didn't make it into your high school textbook. That's our whole thing. And we are just getting started. See you in the next one.